Welcome to A Book Binger. I'm Shelby, and I'm a girl who is going to binge books instead of Netflix. Thanks for listening on our first podcast ever. I'm so excited to be doing this with you guys. My goal in this podcast is to be able to take books that you guys recommend, want to hear about, or are currently reading, and discuss that with you. I'd love to have you guys come on board and share your interests and your comments and opinions, and I'm really excited to get started with this. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast, with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. All right, guys. So for the first book on this podcast, A Book Binger, I wanted to pick something that would grab your attention, but also a book that I've never read before. And when I was looking for this book, I had a very specific idea, but I decided to go to the library for this, and I came across this book and completely changed my mind on how I wanted this podcast to go. So to introduce the book for this week, it's Agatha Christie, The Witness for the Prosecution, and Other Stories. Honestly, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I have never read anything from Agatha Christie. She is one of the top widely published authors of all time. She has only been outsold by the Bible and Shakespeare. Guys, that's crazy. I don't know anybody who has been that widely published before. And as well, that I haven't ever read. So I wanted to find her first book that she ever published, but I couldn't find it at the library. That's one of the downsides if you go to a library, is they only have limited resources when you're there. But I love their catalogs that you can always transfer a book from another location to the location that you go to. Anyway, back to Agatha Christie. She is known as the Queen of Mystery. And since it's now October, I decided what better way to kick this off than to read about mystery. Now, I haven't really read short stories a whole lot. I think because I really enjoy bigger novels. If there's more pages, it's better because they delve more into characters, into the setting, into the plot, and I particularly enjoy that. Having as much content in a book brings the book to life. So with short stories, I haven't been drawn to them as much because, as they are stated, they are short. But in this particular novel of Agatha's, she has 11 different short stories. As I was reading through this, I found it interesting that she kind of has some similarities in each of them. They are different, of course. They all have different premises, characters, and plots. But there are 3 things in particular I noticed that she includes in them. One of them is spirits, ghosts, otherworldly things, premonitions. She mentions that quite a bit in these stories, as well as murder or death. Obviously, she is the Queen of Mystery, so it would be interesting if she didn't have those topics in her novels. Another underlining theme with her short stories was certain psychological issues her characters were experiencing. Many of these stories have at least 1 or 2 characters that undergo a sort of madness. She uses that term mad quite often because at this time, mental illness was not a widely known thing. If there was something going on in your mind, you were hearing voices, you were experiencing things that were unusual, you were seeing things, or as they were mentioned, premonitions, then you were going mad. You were different. You were just having some unworldly experience that people did not want to get into. They didn't want to understand. So a lot of them were institutionalized at this point. One of her short stories I want to delve into because this really broadens my perspective on what it was like to be mad. It's the third short story in this novel, and it is titled The Fourth Man. Now, it has the perspective of this man named Cannon, and Cannon gets on this train, and there are 3 other men in this train that he's sitting with as they're going to Newcastle. And one of these men is a doctor, and he is a neurologist. At that time, it wasn't titled a neurologist, but he specifically helped with those who were going mad. He was very fond of the connections between body, spirit, and soul. And there was one particular woman he was fascinated with. She had become very famous with her multiple personality disorder. But of course, it wasn't titled that at that point. So they had said that she had 4 personalities. They thought maybe she was just a great actor in bringing these personalities alive, but they were very different, and it was alarming to them. This woman, her name was Felicity Balt. Now, Felicity, she, like I mentioned, had 4 different personalities. Felicity was brought up by a very unfortunate family circumstance. Her father was a drunk, and he had killed her mother, and then he had died off as well. So Felicity was brought into a group home, for a lack of term. And Miss Slater was this woman who had built this group home and brought in other kids just like her. Felicity wasn't like the others, though. She was very slow, she was lazy, and they even called her stupid because she couldn't read or write very well. She had a very hard time learning the language, and she couldn't seem to even do very basic household chores. Miss Slater, she had tried to get her to be a housemaid, and it had just failed miserably many times because Felicity was this big lady, and she was slow, she talked different, and nobody really could understand what she was thinking. So Felicity would come back to this group home multiple times. And eventually, these personalities started to form. So there was Felicity 1, Felicity 2, Felicity 3, and Felicity 4. Felicity 1 was the original Felicity Balt. As I had mentioned, she was unable to do a lot of things. However, Felicity 2, she spoke Italian fluently. She spoke German. Her handwriting was exquisite. She played the piano. She spoke French. She would go into these wide discussions of politics and art. And so it was a night and day personality. However, Felicity 3, she was a little bit different as well. She was intellectual, but her morals were very different. She would dive into just filthy language, and she would rail against religion, and she would just start, she would wanting to get into fights. She was a very rebellious and mean woman, Felicity 3 was. However, Felicity 4, she was this dreamy, half-witted creature, and it was, she was kind of aloof. She was just very whimsical, which, as you looked at Felicity, was very different from all of her other personalities. The most common personalities that she experienced were Felicity 1 and Felicity 2. Those would go on for a couple days. And Felicity 3 and Felicity 4 would only go on for a couple hours. So this was very interesting for this doctor, and he was very excited to learn more about her. And now one of the gentlemen on the train, he starts to laugh. And they forgot that he was there because they had thought he was asleep. His name was Raul. Now, Raul, he says, you have no idea who Felicity is. You hear these stories and these rumors. I grew up with Felicity. I know who she is. And she is not the most famous. Annette is the most famous. And let me tell you who Annette is. Annette was another girl who had come up in this home. She had a very unsuccessful family situation as well. Her mother was very sick, and then her father as well. So just like Felicity, she comes into this home. However, Annette and Raul, they become very close. They're best friends. Annette has all these dreams of becoming a famous dancer, riches, lovers, all of these things. And she will protect Raul. Raul will be at her side. Now, Felicity is drawn to Annette. We're not quite sure why or how, but she just is always surrounded by Annette. She's like a little puppy dog. And Annette thinks it's hilarious, and she hates Felicity. She's this big, bulky girl who's slow and stupid and can't speak. So she makes fun of her all the time. And Felicity gets upset, as she rightfully should, but she still hangs around her. So Annette somehow figures out how to hypnotize Felicity, and Felicity does these things for her, and then she gets upset when she realizes what is happening. Well, later on, Annette becomes famous. Raul moves on to something else, and he comes back every once in a while. And Felicity, is stuck at this home because she can't do many things. And then Annette, she one day, her fame, kind of crumbles down, and she gets caught with the sickness that her mother had. So she has to go back to the home where Felicity resides. And Felicity is extremely happy that Annette is back because she knows she's dying. And she feels like she's kind of getting this revenge against her. And Annette just keeps explaining, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I'm not going to die. But Felicity somehow knows that she really is going to die. So eventually Annette dies, and Felicity then has these personalities that come up. But Felicity feels like that's not herself. She tries to explain that this is not her. There is something going on in her mind, and she knows that it's Annette. Because Annette would torment her so much as a child, she just felt that this was something that she was controlling. She was doing it again. She could hear Annette in her mind. And when these personalities would awaken, she would get very, very tired, and then she'd fall asleep and forget. She tried to explain this and tried to explain it, and Raul somehow, he knew that that was the case. That there was this spirit that was connected to Felicity, and that it was Annette's. And she would pop up in these different personalities. So for me, I thought that was super interesting that Agatha brought out that it wasn't Felicity herself who was having these personalities pop up. It wasn't her subconscious. It wasn't her spirit, but it was another person's spirit who was coming into Felicity. It was Annette who was continuing to torture her. But because she had died, she had locked on to Felicity's soul, and she was bringing out these personalities. How interesting of a topic is that? I was just super intrigued by that, and that's one of the stories that stuck out to me the most. And I think that it really brought out, something of Agatha Christie. I felt like she had these ideas stuck in her mind, and she mentioned them so often of spirits and of these mental illnesses. She knew that there was something more going on in our brains. whether or not you were particularly mad or you were experiencing visions or ghosts, there is something more about the human brain that we just don't understand. And I love that she talks about that with her stories. And I want you guys to go out and I want you to read some of these stories that she has, whether they're the short stories or they're more of her famous novels. And I want you to let me know what you guys think of these themes. There's one in particular that I think everybody knows pretty well, and it's The Mousetrap. It's one of her famous novels that was actually made into a movie, as well as a film adaptation of hers is Murder on the Oriental Express. I really enjoyed that movie, and it makes me want to go and read the book. I know there are so many of you guys who have read that book, and I want to hear your opinions on it as well. Should I go read it? Should I put it on this podcast? Should we discuss it together? Or should I just go do that on my own? Because regardless, I'm going to go read it. So thank you guys so much for listening to that short story, and I want you guys to go read it. It's entitled The Fourth Man by Agatha Christie. So good, along with her other short stories in this. The Witness for the Prosecution. Go out, go read it, and tell me what you guys think.